Amazing, it froze again. Are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, wow. Okay, you're
Yeah,
back.
I think I was just sitting still. We're
Awesome.
recording.
Awesome. We're recording. Hello, everybody. I'm Brad Feld, and I'm with Eliot Pepper, who's a two-time author, and we're trying to wrestle Google Hangouts into a short interview to add some spice to the background on Eliot. Eliot, why don't we start? Just give 30 seconds or so on how you became an author.
Yeah, for sure. I was working in startups, and I love Brad's blog. I'm a big fan of his books, and so I sent him a cold email one day when I had the idea to write a startup thriller novel to sort of take the world of entrepreneurship and see if we could set a fun adventure in that world. So I sent him an email. He was super enthusiastic. Thank you, Brad. And the book sort of evolved from there. And eventually, once we had the rough draft together, you started a publishing company, FG Press, and I was lucky enough to be one of its first authors.
Awesome. So you've written two books now, Uncommon Stock 1.0, and then the sequel, which is Power Play. Both are set in Boulder as the main setting, although they got plenty of action in other places like LA and San Francisco. Before you started writing the book, how much time had you spent in Boulder?
6 hours.
6 hours.
Yeah.
So other than trying to win your way into my heart by setting a book in Boulder, what else about Boulder captured you in those 6 hours? Why was that the perfect place for this, what is essentially a startup techno thriller?
So there were a couple things. First of all, I loved those 6 hours. I had a really good time in Boulder when I was there. And I was living in San Diego at the time. And one of the things that I loved so much about Boulder is that it has this thriving entrepreneurship scene, this thriving new tech scene. And I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in Oakland, and so I'm very familiar. I have many friends in Silicon Valley. I now live in Oakland again. But living in San Diego and seeing what Boulder's been able to do in terms of startups, I found really inspiring because it wasn't Silicon Valley. And I thought that would be a really cool way to sort of involve new communities around startups that are coming up in the story, and it just seemed like a perfect home for the characters, so that helped too.
Awesome. Now that you've written two books that are set in Boulder, and I know you spent a little bit more time here, but you really hadn't spent much more time here until you finished Uncommon Stock 1.0. How does your writer's mind and image of Boulder that you create map to having now spent some real time in Boulder and understood it better?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's actually mapped pretty well. I was sort of surprised. One funny thing, I've occasionally been asked, what tools, do you use any fancy tools for writing or through your process? And some writers use different pieces of software that give them powerful tools. And my answer is always I use Yelp. Because I hadn't so much time in Boulder, so I was like, well, where are the characters going to hang out, right? And so it was actually really fun visiting Boulder after the first book came out, because I got to actually go to the Laughing Goat coffee shop, which is the set of one of the scenes in the first book, and check out a couple of the different restaurants that had sort of come to fruition. And the other fun part was meeting some Boulder-based entrepreneurs. So that was also really fun to see what the vibe is culturally at their companies, and then how it fits into the larger community.
Cool. You have a very strong, strong-willed, intellectually strong and tenacious female protagonist, also CEO. Tell us about her.
So her name's Mara Winkle, and she grew up in Pasadena and went to CU Boulder. And she joins forces with her best friend to start a new software company. And sort of the interesting part about their company is that they're using machine learning and new algorithms that her co-founder has developed to basically be the spell check for financial fraud. So their software is able to comb through financial data and highlight problems or inconsistencies. And so then they end up getting caught up in a whole money laundering conspiracy. But the really funny thing about Mara now that the books have come out, is that she's sort of taken on a life of her own. We actually, with one of the things I've really enjoyed working with FG Press and working with you on these books is that we've been basically just having a lot of fun, not only with the content, but also how we're sharing that content. So not just with the story itself, but how we get the word out about the story. So, we created that landing page for Mosaic, which is Mara's startup in the book. Mara actually did an interview that was featured on Tech Cocktail last fall to coincide with the launch of the second book, so that was really fun. So that's been a really good time. And one of the questions I get from my close friends is who's really behind this character? My wife, Drea, is a very strong-willed, very intelligent woman. And I also have a lot of very strong-willed, intelligent women in my life. And we've had a number of very close friends who were female tech entrepreneurs. And so all of them get questions from their friends whether they are the basis for Mara, which is really, really fun.
You're now I know deep in the process for writing the third book in the series. Have you had any insights into your own writing process and how it's evolved from that first book to the third book?
Yeah, it's actually changed a lot. Writing is very much a craft, and so it's been a learning process for me. I really see myself right at the beginning of learning that craft and sort of putting up my 10,000 hours, right? And for book one, I literally sat down at my computer and started typing. I just opened a Word document and started. I didn't lay out the characters. I didn't write up bios on them or something. I didn't outline the story at all. I just started writing, and that was I actually really loved getting into it that way because it allowed me to just learn as I went. And the upshot was that once we got into editing, at the end of the day, I did 7 major revisions based on feedback from beta readers and editors and all that kind of stuff. And so there was more work on the back end. And for the second book, it was a little bit more structured. I certainly didn't outline it extensively, but I did know where I wanted to go. I actually found that it was really helpful to know where I wanted to end up at the end of the day, and then maybe the next 2 or 3 scenes that I wanted to write. And there are probably some corollaries there to entrepreneurship itself, right? I mean, when you're doing product development, you do want to have that ultimate vision, and then you also need to really understand what those immediate next steps are to get you there.
Who are some of the writers that inspired you, especially sort of in this context of startup fiction, which is a category that we've seen a couple of books in, including yours. Most of them are techno thrillers more than they're sort of startup fiction, but they overlap a little bit. But who are you emulating? Who's inspired you? Who do you read to get a sense of how to build a story arc around fiction like this?
Sure. So that's a really good question. As you said, there aren't that many true, pure startup thrillers, or I haven't read that many yet. Many of my inspiration, I read a lot. I read all different genres, all different kinds of books, and so I love reading. I've read a lot of techno thrillers, which definitely this book draws some inspiration from. So I know we both read Will Hertling, and his Singularity series is awesome. And in fact, probably the first book, Avogadro Corp, is closer to Uncommon Stock because it sort of takes place at almost a fictional Google, right? So it's more near term. His books then go farther and farther into the future. But I love his work. I love Cryptonomicon or Reamd. I don't know if you've read Reamd, but
I love Reamd.
Yeah, Reamd was awesome. One of its characters is an entrepreneur. Yeah, and The Martian. Which came out last year, so but that was influential for me, and that's actually become one of the books that I most recommend to friends who are interested in starting their first company, because I just feel like there are so many emotional lessons in that book about grit and just sort of outside the box thinking, which is really, really cool. So, but I mean, I read all over the place. I also love the Einstein biography by Walter Isaacson. I think there's a ton out there, and it's a lot of fun to dip into a bunch of different pools.
Cool. Last question. What advice would you give someone who wants to write their first fiction book? I have this idea. I want to write a novel. Like, as somebody who's now written, 2 and is on your 3rd book, what's the advice for that person who's been talking about that and carrying that thought around with him or her?
Start right now. I mean, I really think that's the key. One thing that you'll very quickly realize after you write any book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is that about 70% of your friends will then say to you, "Oh, I've always thought of writing a book," right? And that's sort of most people have, right? Whether you dream about it in high school or you think about it when you have some cool idea. And the thing that I think is really beautiful about writing is that it's a craft and it takes a lot of work to master, but the barriers to entry are zip, right? I mean, we all learn to write, hopefully, in elementary school. We all have access to a word processor or a notebook. It's one of these things that, writing, and, once you've written something, it makes your ideas scalable. And that's really, really exciting, right? That means that if you see something that other people don't see in the world, and you can condense that and tell the story of that idea in a meaningful way, that it can reach far more people than you could ever reach on your own. And I think that that's really powerful, and I think that if you've ever dreamed of writing a story or writing a book, fiction or nonfiction, just get started. Open that Word document, because there's no better time than now.
Awesome. Eliot, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. Bye.